¿Cómo se comparan los mini estados y el anarquismo?
How do microstates and anarchism compare? Anarchism, in some way, has similarities with microstates, because in anarchism, if I understand it correctly, small autonomous communities emerge, where one could live in a place where there is a leadership, where there is organization, but individuals are also free to move or change from one community to another. How do microstates and anarchism compare? Perhaps we start with Professor Bastos.
A ver, es un tema bien interesante. A ver, primero yo pienso que el individuo...
It's a very interesting topic. Firstly, I think that the individual does not live in a solitary and atomistic way. He doesn't live alone. Usually, every individual, even in a society with a small state or a stateless society, has to live in some kind of community. He has to live associated with other people. It is very difficult for him to live alone. The idea that comes many times from neoclassical theory or from liberalism, especially from public choice, is that we are maximizing individuals. I don't think it's exactly like that. An individual is embedded in some kind of community, right? And you have to live in it. Now, that community, if it is small, is very difficult to distinguish from anarchy, because the scope of power in a small community is much smaller in scope than in centralized states. The control is much smaller. If it is small, it has to compete with many similar political units, and that competition, usually, is downward. A small political unit, a unit of 1,000 inhabitants, 2,000 inhabitants, is hardly distinguishable from anarchy, although it may not be.
Podemos hablar de Liechtenstein, que es un ejemplo que le gusta mucho a usted, ¿no?
We can talk about Liechtenstein. It is an example that you like a lot, right? Andorra, Luxembourg. Can we consider them microstates?
Para que Liechtenstein tiene un aspecto que me gusta mucho, que es el derecho de secesión.
The thing is that Liechtenstein has something I like a lot, which is the right of secession. If a group or collective has the right to secede, it differs very little from anarchy, because it already is, in a certain way, a voluntary community, a voluntary association, although it is not exactly like that, because if you can leave without cost, without wars, and legally, that is similar to anarchy, because if you are integrated into that group, it's because you want to be. It is not anarchy, obviously. I guess there is still something missing, but it must be the closest to anarchy in the modern world.
¿Cuál sería el tamaño tal vez óptimo?
And what would the optimal size of these communities within anarchism be?
Esto hasta acá, ¿sabes? En democracia.
There isn't. This is already explained. In Size and Democracy, Robert Allen Dahl says he recommends small cities, but there is no minimum state scale, a specific number.
En Islandia, que hay un centro de estudios de microestados.
In Iceland, there is a center of microstate studies. It is a bit what the professor said, right? There is no exact number, but they classify every state of less than 500,000 inhabitants as microstates. Of course, there is a lot of variety. Liechtenstein is similar to an anarchy, but not all microstates are anarchic, because there is central planning in some microstates, and there are very socialist policies. Iceland is an example of this, right? It is a small country. It is a country where the population lives concentrated in the same place. However, it is a country with highly planned public policies, with a very communal culture.
Por su propio tamaño tiene que estar abierto al mercado mundial. Pues es muy difícil que sea proteccionista.
Due to its own size, it has to be open to the world market. It is very difficult for them to be protectionists, because they need resources from outside, and to sell their resources outside, they cannot be self-sufficient.
Bueno, creo que todos los discípulos del profesor sabemos una cosa. Los microestados y las comunidades políticas pequeñas.
I think all the disciples of Professor Bastos know one thing. Counterintuitively, small units support integration instead of disintegration, because they need to trade to survive, to satisfy the needs of the individuals who live there. And I think that everyone who has gone to the classes with the professor know that. And many people don't keep that in mind. Many people think in macro terms, not micro.
Por ejemplo, si usted necesita un dinero, una moneda esta tan pequeña escala es un poco ridícula.
Also, for example, a state currency on such a small scale is a bit ridiculous. So they end up integrating or doing a currency board, or using a bigger currency. The one with a language of few speakers ends up being integrated into the most spoken language, not into the least. When Europe was fragmented in the Middle Ages, it had only one kind of money. There was a currency, gold and silver, and there was nothing else. Each one spoke their own language, but they had a common language which was Latin, because no language was enough to access high culture. So, a student of the Middle Ages in those days could read any written book, and study at any university without problem. They had a system of law, they had common laws, money, and so on. In the end, it's integrated.
Pero ¿cómo evitamos esa centralización?
But how do we avoid this unwanted centralization of government functions?
A ver, yo yo creo que el discurso político, no sé exactamente a quién se debe, es un discurso centralizador.
First, knowing it. The political narrative, I don't know exactly where it comes from, is a centralizing narrative. It is a logic of scale. It seems that bigger is better and more efficient, and that there are economies of scale, and that a united Europe is stronger than divided states, right? Regarding the European Union, I am a pro-European. I am very pro-European. Therefore, I do not want a European Union, because Europe was never, ever united, and all its successes, the ones it had, are due to having been divided, always. The comparison, for example, that the theorists always make is with China. China also had stages and China unified. Since it unified, it started to fall. And this is very important to know. So that logic can be debated. That's why I am a Europeanist, because I follow the authentic genius of Europe, that was never about being united. Now there is that logic that a larger scale is better. Why? Why is it better? The Union doesn't even know how to buy vaccines. That's just how it is. It's the same logic that led to China's historical decline. They want to buy everything centrally. Central planning systems never work.
Se vio en el caso, por ejemplo, de España, se vio con el mando único.
We have seen this in Spain with the single command. When trying to buy materials, the creation of a single command caused a shortage, obscene shortages, of masks, screens, respirators, and so on. When vaccines are centrally bought, there is a shortage too. In other words, an absolute lack of control, and in the end there are no vaccines. So, I think we have to bet on polycentric models that take into account that the most relevant political unit is the one that is closest to the individual, and the closest political unit to the individual is a local government. Liechtenstein, although it is a state, it is still a local government, and little. Andorra is a local government. Something that nobody says, because maybe it is politically incorrect to say it, is that the governments that the population trusts the most are the local governments. The population more or less trust the mayor. They distrust the legislative power. In Latin America, the same. When you see the indicators, the government people trust the most is the local government. They don't trust the deputies nor the president. It's because of the closeness. It's because of the control. It's because I am better informed. I know if the current mayor is a despot or he is not a despot, whether he does things well or he does them badly, who he benefits and who he doesn't benefit.
La pluralidad, la fragmentación de estados, tuvo unos efectos muy positivos en Europa.
Furthermore, the plurality, the fragmentation of states, had very positive effects in Europe, and it is precisely due to that fragmentation. It is thoroughly explained. Eric L. Jones explains it, for example. Jean Batchelor explains it. Ruben Zorilla, for example. Joel Mokyr recently explained it. Another recent book by David Kossindy goes along the same line. The book that the historian Walter Schiedel has just published, Escape from Rome, says that the best thing that Rome did, and that the success that Rome had, was to have broken in 1,000 states, which was what gave the historical triumph to Europe, because it allows innovation. Someone invented a labor-saving machine. The emperor ordered it to be burned and broken, and to execute the inventor. He said it was going to generate unemployment. And the Roman emperor was able to ban the machine throughout the Roman Empire. If such a machine was invented in a fragmented Europe, indeed, in one place it could have been banned, but not in others. That is Joel Mokyr's thesis. When there is an innovation, some emperors or kings, for whatever reason, might want to try to ban it. But since Europe was so fragmented, they couldn't, because there was always somewhere in which it prospered and was later imitated. The triumph of capitalism is largely due to that.
Las ideas que nacen en algún sitio fueron prohibidas.
Ideas were somewhere banned, but in other places they were accepted. It's happened also with authors and ideas.
Estamos hablando de problemas a nivel local, ¿no?
We are talking about problems at a local level. So what kind of problems do we discuss? Where does the road have to be built? What should the streets be like? Are neighbors bothering you? Should a nightclub be put here or not? We are not talking about abstract ideas. The debate is much more specific and much more everyday, perhaps.
Leopold Kohr, los teóricos de la escala, cuando un Estado se mete en escalas mayores, también se ponen gastos mayores.
Leopold Kohr, the scale theorists. When a state expands to larger scales, it incurs higher expenses on things it didn't buy before. For example, Ireland is a maritime country, but it does not have any aircraft carrier, nor does it need to. It seems to survive just fine without it. When a maritime state is bigger, it wants to buy an aircraft carrier, a submarine, and other things. What is the advantage of having that? There may be some advantages. I'm not saying there aren't any, but now it wants to change scale. It wants to get into another kind of business. It now wants to project power. On the other hand, a small country knows it can't buy that. It doesn't have it. People don't live worse because of that.
De hecho, la gente vive mejor. O sea, el otro día discutíamos.
In fact, people live better. The other day, we were discussing Machiavelli, and obviously, Machiavelli grows in a fragmented Italy, with a lot of political units. When you look at reality, it turns out that the fellow citizens, that is, Machiavelli's neighbours, lived much better than anyone in Spain or in the Kingdom of France. They had the highest income in Europe. That commercial mentality, motivated by fragmentation, generates prosperity for all.
Esa es la doctrina de la constelación de los estados.
That is the doctrine of the constellation of states. Many times they say that the same nation or the same culture have to have only one state. On the other hand, many authors, Coe for example, but later Lauro Martinez for example, when he studies the Renaissance, explains, no, the same culture can be perfectly fragmented in many states and nothing happens. And this is proven, for example, by the Greek polis, which numbered almost 100 depending on the time. They were a small territory, many polis. These polis did so many things and in a relatively short period of time. They lasted 100 years, I think. And look at the things they did. Renaissance Italy, for example, the Hispanic taifas, or the fragmented Germany until the middle of the 19th century. Netherlands also, the United Provinces. With its United Provinces, they defeated an empire. The United Provinces got along badly with each other, and despite getting along badly with each other, they were still able to stand up to an empire. That war ruined Spain. Switzerland is actually hyper-fragmented as well.
Quería pasar a la siguiente pregunta también sobre el tema militar.
I wanted to move on to the next question, also on the military issue. Are many states viable if they do not have a larger neighbouring country that is powerful in military terms?
Yo sé que son más viejos que los estados tradicionales. Por ejemplo, Andorra es más vieja que España.
I know that they are older than traditional states. For example, Andorra is older than Spain, San Marino than Italy, for example, and Monaco I think too. I don't know how they do it. But of course, they are viable and manage to survive, right? They negotiate, they reach agreements, and without weapons. Defense is not only with weapons, it can be done with pacts, negotiations, agreements, or things like that. The Vatican is much older than any other state on earth. How do they do that? I don't know, but they are capable of surviving, and there they are.
Bueno, Mónaco en la segunda mitad del siglo XX, Charles de Gaulle.
Charles de Gaulle, in the second half of the 20th century, wanted to occupy Monaco, but it survived and resisted, thanks to the diplomatic skills of the king. Much larger states were not capable.
Los reinos perdidos, ahí le cuento un montón de reinos grandes.
In Vanished Kingdoms, Norman Davis mentions a lot of big kingdoms that disappeared. Look at the Kingdom of Aragon.
Hay una opción para los estados pequeños en términos defensivos.
There is also an option for small states in defensive terms that Professor Bastos is also a fan of, which is the Hanse, the League. That is, small cities can join to defend themselves. In case diplomatic paths are of no use, in case the pacts do not work, there is a way, which is the way of diplomatic relations to defend and build an association league. And in case that fails, there are also private troops.
Los estados normales al final se asocian incluso entre ellos.
Also, normal states associate with each other. Which European state is capable of withstanding an attack from a great power? If we talk about capability, what state would it be? With an atomic bomb, maybe. NATO is a defensive league. That league can be done on a smaller scale.
Esos pactos no corren el riesgo de terminar en algo permanente.
Are these agreements at risk of ending up in something permanent? The centralization, those pacts. Can a case be made about the European Union? At the beginning it was a defense pact, and it's ended up becoming this big monster.
Yo creo que la Unión Europea, precisamente en defensa, es un gran fracaso.
I believe that the European Union is a great failure, particularly in terms of defense. The European defense community and the European political community in the 50s, because the monopoly on violence is part of the DNA of the states. I see a microstate being more viable. Again, just as microstates tend to integrate and associate commercially, there are also more incentives to join forces in defense. And if they are large states, I don't know if it's a good idea to join. Even so, they associate if the threat is greater, as in the case of NATO.
Pasa que al final la OTAN te acaba metiendo en líos que no te meterías solo.
What happens is that NATO involves you in conflicts that you wouldn't get involved in alone. You multiply the capacity for conflict of each of the members. If France has trouble in Mali or Syria, they all end up in trouble of this kind. If you are a microstate, you don't become stupid. You know you have a rival and you team up. The resistance that the princes made to all the advances of the Turks, or the Greek polis when they faced Persia, which was much bigger, They were divided, but they saw the convenience and they joined. And they were able to stand up at that specific moment. And then they each returned to their homes.
Cuando se habla de microestados, se habla de este tipo de cuestiones militares en clave defensiva, no ofensiva.
Talking about microstates, we talk about these types of military issues in a defensive way, not offensive. And I think that is the greatest of virtues. The Greek cities were defending themselves. There is no higher form of legitimate violence. It is legitimate defense against invasion from a foreigner, right? The Hansi was also defending itself. I mean, the use of violence is far more legitimate, particularly in discussions about security, because it's never about occupying another's territory or imposing on another's territory. No, it's about defense. I don't see Andorra invading places. I do see Russia invading, not Andorra.
No hay este problema de free rider.
But isn't there this free rider problem? Can these pacts generate free rider problems? Where one can say, I'm going to invest a little less in military defense so that in the pact the other one pays the bills.
Depende cómo se pacte, ¿no?
It depends on how it is agreed, right? In NATO there is a free riding in the sense that costs are disproportionately borne to the United States. But I guess you are referring to a small state free riding of the big one. It benefits the small states, but also, I suppose, it will collaborate in defense if necessary, for their own interest too. There are the old debates of what is easier to conquer, a compact united territory or many small states. Large empires, for example, of America were easily conquered. It's called toppling. It is enough to simply conquer the top, and that's it. You cut off the head. The question is, Cortez, for example, with the troops he had, would he conquer Mexico if Mexico was divided into 20? Would Pizarro conquer Peru? Just like many other empires in other areas, with relatively few people, it is enough to conquer the head. If you had many heads, would it be easier to conquer? The cost increases when you have to conquer all areas with their own leaders, with their own governments.
La fragmentación, al subir esos costes, lo que hace es aumentar las probabilidades.
Fragmentation raises the costs when it comes to conquering, also increases the odds of the unconquered discovering defensive formulas, because you save time. By not cutting off a central head, having to cut off 20 heads, when you cut the second, the other 18 are already thinking how they are going to defend themselves.
Europa no fue ocupada nunca, con toda la fragmentación que tuvo.
Europe was never occupied thanks to all the fragmentation it had. China fell in a short period of time against Genghis Khan, and it was an immense empire. Europe was never conquered, for whatever reasons, neither the Arabs nor any external rival. That fragmented thing resisted much better than very big empires. Although it later gains legitimacy, the state's origin is banditry. It is a conquest of territory, and the more territory and resources and population they control, the more resources the ruling class obtains. It's that obvious. That's why they do have an incentive to increase the size of the state. I always ask, a citizen of Andorra compared to a citizen of India? It's a very big country, isn't it? Or from China? What do the Chinese have that the Andorrans don't have? I'm not talking about the elites. Xi Jinping has more power than the Prime Minister of Andorra. I agree with that. Now, a countryman, a citizen, a man who is a factory worker or a shop worker, a Chinese worker versus a worker from Andorra, what do the Chinese have for being so big that Andorrans don't have? Do they get served faster at bars? Are they allowed to enter the cinema earlier because they are Chinese? I'm just asking, what privileges do they have for being so big? Better Wi-Fi connection, colder beer? I don't know what advantage the Chinese have.
Lo que tiene son desventajas. La ciudadanía que habita en microestados.
I believe that there are disadvantages. Citizens who live in microstates live better and control their decision makers better. An ordinary Chinese person, even if he has money, cannot influence decision makers through any channel, not even through informal channels. However, a citizen of Andorra can. He can talk to his president. He sees him on the streets. He greets him. He knows who his children are. They probably share a school. They probably have the same healthcare. And that idea of community, counterintuitively, as the professor said at the beginning, it is very healthy for an individual, for social life, to be embedded in a community. And then all these philosophies. We can dedicate another day to criticizing republicanism, but unintentionally, in that community there is a lot of commitment to public life. Because, in the end, if I am closer to my decision maker, if I see that the street is dirty, I will call. If I see that the street light is broken or it doesn't light, I'll call. It's the difference between towns and big cities. In the towns, I believe that everything works better and that politics matters less.
Lo llama skin in the game, ¿no? Tal vez, pero hablando de éxitos del Estado centralizado.
Taleb calls it skin in the game. Speaking of successes of the centralized states, isn't there a case with vaccinations? Have centralized states had more strength in the negotiations with Big Pharma?
En Serbia estamos vacunados más fácilmente, o Islandia más fácilmente.
Do you believe so? Do you believe that in Serbia they are more easily vaccinated, or Iceland, or even Morocco, than the European Union? That's the problem of scale. We are used to it, and I think we are taught that logic at school. It is Cartesianism, the idea of what is reason and rational, the idea that scale is efficient. Indeed, there are decreasing costs when you scale. That's correct. Scaling decreases costs, but there are increasing costs in distribution. This is Borsodi's law. That rule is not cited as a counterweight. Producing things on a larger scale is cheaper, but the cheaper the production, the more expensive the distribution of the product. You can buy many vaccines, but then you have to distribute them, and any failure is a failure on a very large scale. The scale is not appreciated. No one buys olive oil with their neighbours, and it would be cheaper. You get together, all the neighbours of your building, if it is a large building, you gather in an assembly, let's all buy oil together. And indeed, you negotiate with a store, and if you are many, you buy it on a large scale and it is cheaper. Why don't they do it? Because you have to store it, you have to distribute it. If I run out of oil before you, I have to wait for the others to run out to buy it again. There are a number of costs which make the process much less agile, although it is easier to bring a can of oil for the entire building.
Sí, o sea, lo que usted dice es que no puedes separar la adquisición de la vacuna en este ejemplo.
So, what you are saying is that you can't separate the acquisition of the vaccine, in this example, from the distribution.
Claro, el almacenamiento y una serie de costos. Claro, es un problema de planificación central.
Storage of vaccines is very expensive too, and other costs. It's a central planning problem. You plan the purchase, but do you have the transportation planned? At first there was that problem with cold storage. Later it was fixed, right? There were not enough refrigerators. It took a while to solve that. There were no needles at first, because a thing was developed, but not everything was developed at once. It was a centralized thing, bought without having the logistics infrastructure, and many problems came from there. In a small-scale scenario, a vaccine maybe costs 5 times more, but would it be cheap or expensive? Imagine the Pfizer vaccine cost 10 euros. If a small state bought it at 100 euros, would it be expensive or cheap? If you take into account the damages that the large-scale central planners did, the businesses that went bankrupt in Europe, the lives that could be saved, wouldn't it be cheap to buy it at a high cost?
¿Qué piensa de feudalismo?
What do you think of feudalism and its legal evolution in relation to private property rights?
El libro de Hertz, ¿no? La invención de la Edad Media.
I always recommend the book by Heers, Le Moyen Age, une imposture. It is a very good book. I defend the feudal order. Obviously, I do not defend the way of life in the Middle Ages, it was very poor, but absolutism wasn't much better when it was centralized. What I'm saying is that the Middle Ages is a demonized age. All historians, especially from the Renaissance to here, and especially the enlightened ones, denigrate it. They say it is a dark age of darkness, when actually most of the witch burnings, inquisitions, and all that are from the Renaissance. They are not from the Middle Ages. Jack Heers demystifies it. So I think feudalism is okay. First, it was not a sovereign power. The power was a polyarchy. There were many powers in the same place. There was the power of the church, there was the power of the feudal lord, there was a diffuse power of the emperor. There were many competing powers, and also phenomena such as the liege homage, which means that I am your king, but at the same time I am your subject in another territory. So it was something that today seems very strange to us, because we are used to that compact thinking. We are used to the Cartesian rationale in which there has to be only one government in each place, a map. We don't understand that you and I can have different laws. It was like that. If you were a foreigner or had a special jurisdiction, you had a different law than mine. Now we are returning to that with panarchy, but they have a medieval origin. So I think it's okay. Obviously, like every stage, there were abuses. I don't think there were greater abusers than those who came later. It seems like the Renaissance was an age of glory, but they returned to slavery. The Inquisition was created. Large-scale censorship was established. Nation-states are created and a lot of places are invaded in wars on a scale never seen before. But the Middle Ages are famous for being something bad. But if we investigate, it is not.
Y hemos hablado de Holanda, de Alemania, del Imperio Español.
And we have talked about the Netherlands, Germany, the Spanish Empire, the Roman Empire. And many were fragmented. There were feudal leaders locally, and somehow they left them alone as long as they paid a certain level of taxes. And when the tax level was surpassed, there was a clash.
Acostumbrados a pensar el pasado en términos del presente.
We are used to thinking about the past in terms of the present. We think that the Roman Empire is like nowadays. There was an emperor who ruled in everything that was the Roman Empire. But then you read the Bible and you see that Herod was there. How? A king in the middle of the empire? Well, he was a vassal king of the Roman Empire, but he was in charge of his territory. And then the Roman Empire did not control the territory like it is controlled by a modern state. It controlled a few key cities and some commercial routes. Much of the population lived outside the control of the state, at least in Europe.
Que señala Michael Mann, ¿no? De poder despótico y poder infraestructural.
That's precisely what Michael Mann points out, right? Despotic power and infrastructural power. Curiously, in pre-modern or pre-state forms, there was more despotic power. The feudal lord had a lot of despotic power, legally speaking, but his capacity to exercise that power was very low. That is, if someone lived 100 kilometers away from the capital of the fief, the feudal lord had little influence on your life. But with the evolution of the modern state, infrastructural power grows. The ability of the state to come to your house, enter your house, tell you how much you have to pay, take you to jail, that has to be considered. Our societies appear to be more legitimate, but the decision maker has much more infrastructural power and more ability to invade our private lives.
No, y de determinar tu educación, tu forma de pensar.
And to determine your education, your way of thinking, how much income belongs to you and how much does not, because they have all the tax records. Now we get something from the treasury and they tell us how much we have to pay.
Claro, el mundo medieval es un mundo en el que el individuo importa poco, ¿no?
In the medieval world, the individual doesn't matter much. They are organic communities. You belong to the aristocracy, or you belong to the clergy, or you are part of the vassalage. As an individual, you have little room for maneuver. But in terms of counterweights to power, I think there were more counterweights than in the absolutist world, which is the world that comes later. Curiously, absolutism is the evolution of the Renaissance, right? Absolute patrimonialization of the state by the king. The creation of the modern state.
Bueno, vamos a seguir a la siguiente pregunta.
Let's continue with the next question. Does the economic failure of microstates in the Caribbean or Oceania have something to do with their small size?
No. Las Islas Comores, que son microestados, pusieron un régimen socialista.
No. Comoros Islands, which is a microstate, they established a socialist regime and went bankrupt like the others. The main factor that explains success or failure is always the economic system. There is no doubt about that. It's easier for a small country to adapt a free economic system of this kind than a big state. Because if you are a little conscious, you know that you have to open up to commerce. If now I put socialism on a micro island, who do you buy and sell to? If you have a currency that has no value, how do you buy, sell, exchange, and so on? But not all of them do badly. Being a microstate does not guarantee success.
Yo en su momento escribí a este centro de microestados de Islandia.
In the past, I wrote to this microstate centre of Iceland to see if they were interested in those of the Caribbean. But in fact, yes, the economic failure is evident. I don't think it's because of the political system. I think it's because of the economic system. As the professor said, many times what they intend is to plunder their own populations in a mediocre way. If they were rational, they could plunder, in the longer term, with better results for them if they were able to integrate those microstates in global trade flows and so on.
Y los grandes estados del Caribe van mucho mejor.
And the great states of the Caribbean are much better? Venezuela, which is a great state in the Caribbean, is it much better than the microstates? If it is big, then it would have to do better too.
Hay microestados del Caribe que van bien porque Bahamas tiene un PIB per cápita.
And there are also microstates from the Caribbean that are doing okay. Bahamas has an excellent GDP per capita. The Cayman Islands,
El fiscal me dirán, bueno, pues el país fiscal cada uno vive de lo que sabe hacer.
of course, they are tax havens, they will tell me. Some live from banking, others live from skiing, or whatever. Each one lives by what he knows how to do. Liechtenstein people think they live off the banks. In Liechtenstein, the main industry is the precision industry, for example, for very high quality dentists. The comparison can be made in Europe. Take the smallest states of the European Union and the biggest ones. The smallest states in Europe, whether or not they are in the European Union, and the biggest ones, and make an average. You'll see which ones are in a better position.
Usted sabe que yo soy un discípulo de Jesús Huerta Soto.
You know that I am a disciple of Jesus Huerta de Soto. I think you are both, in Spain, the references of anarcho-capitalism. Do you have any disagreements with Jesus? Or do you agree on practically everything?
Yo lo que veo a veces es que en el capitalismo, como entiende él,
What I see sometimes is that anarcho-capitalism, as he understands it, maybe I'm wrong, is like Spain but without a state. There is the image of Spain. An anarcho-capitalist society would not be Spain, it would be small communities of Spanish culture. Why must a nation have a single state? Why can't there be a plurality of, for example, Castilians, as there was in Italy, as there was in Germany? Why does that feel so irrational? Why does it have to be all together in one? That is the point. So, there can be many small communities that are associated with each other for cultural reasons. It's that simple.
¿Y existe eso? ¿Existen estados fragmentados?
Are there fragmented states where you have the same culture as your neighbor?
Yo creo que si preguntamos en Suiza, todos sienten
I believe that if we ask people in Switzerland, everyone feels they are part of a Swiss nation and that there is such a thing as a Swiss nation. But nevertheless, Switzerland is hyper-fragmented. There is brutal tax competition. The central government is super weak. Decisions are made at a local level, and that does not affect the life of the nation. Quite the opposite. The nation prospers and citizens move in that nation according to their preferences, without eroding the system. Maybe in other territories, in other socio-spatial areas, as Michael Mann says, there are several competing national feelings at the same time, and then citizens come together based on their preferences and their identities in one place or another. I don't see that there is a problem with that.
Puede tener una nación, un sentimiento nacional, pero puede estar dividido en varios estados.
One can have a nation as a national sentiment, but it can be divided into several states. I just don't understand the problem with that. I mean, Goethe wasn't German. He was from Weimar, if I remember correctly. Is there something wrong if there were others in Baden, Württemberg, or other places? Wasn't everyone there German? Was it better for Germany to join?
o Maquiavelo no era italiano.
Wasn't Machiavelli Italian? He more or less said it.
Yo creo que la política, desde mi punto de vista, se tiene que construir de abajo arriba.
I believe that politics, from my point of view, has to be built from bottom to top. The state does it the other way round. The state has a very perverse narrative, and it's like some kind of scam for the citizens, because from top to bottom it imposes conditions. We are talking about the opposite process, right? The bottom-up process. People, by their own initiative, establish a community. If they feel uncomfortable in a community, they move to another in which they feel more comfortable. We do not deny the existence of the community, because the human being is a social being, and obviously, I don't deny national issues. I do believe that nations are in competition. They are narratives that have to do with traditions, with customs. But there are people who self-identify as part of a nation, and their national feeling can change throughout their lives. So, to deny that nations exist is to deny reality. But the political system and the relationship with that nation, why does it have to be what the state says? It can be varied. There is no problem. Maybe it's even better for the nation's own sustainability.
Pero no hay esa idea como de ver los países.
But isn't there that idea of countries, cultural identity, like a football game sometimes?
Hombre, a lo mejor una escala más pequeña, a lo mejor en una ciudad de Holanda contra otra jugando con el fútbol, pues toma un partido por su ciudad.
But there is nothing wrong. Maybe on a smaller scale, there is one city in Holland against another playing a game of soccer for its city. And that's okay. It's an innocent game. Same as in class when I was little. Those from class A against the class B. We had a certain class identity. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem starts when it gets worse and then leads to violence. But it doesn't have to. Nationalism is like any other idea. Religion doesn't have to be a bad thing either, although there are violent religions.
¿Y usted cree que esa es
And do you think that is the difference you could have with Jesus Huerta de Soto?
No, digo que el esquema.
No, I'm saying that the mental scheme is like a kind of Spain, but all the functions the Spanish state has are done privately. And I'm saying that I wouldn't think in terms of Spain, I would think in terms of communities of another kind. Because many times what I see is that you take the state as it is and you just privatize its functions. And it would not only be a privatization of services, it would be a change in the scale of the provision of services.
Luego hay otro tema que es un tema muy interesante que ha lanzado el profesor que no hemos discutido.
There is another interesting topic the professor has raised, and we haven't discussed: overlapping jurisdictions. It seems that people don't want to accept that. And that is very healthy, because overlapping jurisdictions show fragmentation of power. If we are worried about protecting the structure of freedoms of people, overlapping jurisdictions are probably a good instrument to protect them, right? For example, there are speeches like, municipalities must be eliminated, we have to rationalize, put a minimum number of something, we need a single administration in charge of a jurisdiction and avoid duplications. I'm against that. I am in favor of duplicities. The citizen knows who provides a good or bad service. The citizen can appeal to an administration if the other hurts him. Those things, under the mentality of a compact single state, seem to be inefficient.
Es la mente cartesiana, la mente jacobina, así de una.
It is the Cartesian mind, the Jacobin mind. They want one thing, nothing duplicated, because it seems irrational, right? And it is not like that. It's good that there are several competing transportation systems: railway transport, road transport, air transport, naval transport. What's wrong with them competing with each other? There is nothing wrong with that. For example, in Spain, when they talk about eliminating duplications, what do we delete? The police or the civil guard? Which of the two is unnecessary? They are not unnecessary.
Lo mismo en Nueva York, ¿no? 200 agencias de policía en el estado de Nueva York.
Sí.
Que es...
The same in New York, 200 police agencies in New York State. Is that one of the problems in Guatemala, that we do not accept this duplicity? Sometimes we talk about sovereignty and how international or local laws clash with indigenous laws.
Pues efectivamente, hay que aprender a entender el derecho indígena.
Indeed, we have to learn to understand indigenous law. Maybe you have to put red lines on them, but there are things about that law that are positive for the community. You have to learn to delegate authority to the local government. Today, it is mistreated by Guatemalan legislation. This is a hyper-centralized state that its citizens distrust. They trust the local government, which, unfortunately, has no powers to deal with most problems that affect people's daily lives, except for large municipalities like the capital city. But of course, there are 340 municipalities here, right? The first thing is to bet on the government that is closest to the person. Just by fostering the mentality that the one that is closest must have more authority would be a lot of progress. This is something we have discussed several times as well. Why does a mining company that settles on the outskirts of the country have to pay taxes in the centre of the country? If it contaminates, why can't you come to an agreement with the local community and say, I contaminated, but I'll give you training, I'll give you a higher salary, I'll give you a park, and there is redistribution.
Lo que hablo de justicia solapada, por ejemplo, la escala para prestar educación, a lo mejor es una.
For example, on the topic about overlapping jurisdictions, maybe there is only one scale for providing education. The scale to provide healthcare is different. The scale of the firefighters perhaps is different. We have one administration that provides all those services. I believe that the Swiss administration can perfectly overlap. Education for 2 cantons, health for 1 or 1.5. The scale is functional, not administrative, and nothing happens if administrations overlap. For example, the libraries, which is a topic that I know well. There is a state library system, there is a university library system, there is a regional library system, and there is a local library system in Spain, for example. Does something happen? Each one has their audience, but they complement each other. If it was just one single library, it wouldn't work so well, because each one has its audience. They complement each other. I, sometimes, curiously find books in local libraries, and if I wanted to study something more complicated, I go to a library where there are those books. They are usually free access as well, all libraries, but nothing happens if there are different levels. If they say, we have to create a single library, okay, but a single library, for example, would be a large library. Maybe that library loses the proximity that the local library has, the one that children approach for the first time. And that's what the state does in other areas too. I have the local library, they even have children's books there. Children play there. They are small places. They have books for adults too, but it is a library that has easy access. It doesn't scare you. On the other hand, the university library scares someone from outside because it has barriers, things like that. They all complement each other. If I create a university library for everything, many people would not dare to enter for the first time, because they wouldn't be comfortable there.
Quería ir a una pregunta completamente diferente.
I wanted to ask a totally different question. What do you think of Schumpeter?
A mí me cae bien. A ver, es un señor. Yo leí la biografía de Robert Loring Allen.
I like him. I read the biography of Robert Loring Allen a long time ago, when I was young, and I really liked the figure. He was a failed banker. The idea of him as a suffering being, right? The idea of him being a failure. He was briefly married. His wife and daughter died, so he suffered all his life. He was a failed minister of finance. He was a failed banker. In fact, the bank went bankrupt and he owed a lot of money. And that was when he went to live at Harvard. But I like his work. I like capitalism, socialism and democracy. I like the sociology of imperialism. I like it a lot. History of economic analysis. The theory of economic development. He is an author that always interested me. Although I don't share everything he said. He was a kind of Moses. He led mathematics to the economy but never entered it. He was very pro-math. He also saw socialism as something inevitable, and he regrets that because he defended capitalism. Also, the idea of the lack of saints and heroes in capitalism always caught my attention. Every political or economic system tends to have some kind of extra economic value, so that people are willing to fight and sacrifice for it. And capitalism is not capable of generating a world of saints, heroes, martyrs who are capable of fighting for it. That's why he said that very graphic thing. The capitalist can run a company, but is not capable of throwing a goose out of the office. He needs someone to throw him out. And that makes social leadership very difficult. The feudal lord would catch the goose and he would roast it, right? He would grab him by the neck and throw him out. Schumpeter is almost the father of public choice. He was a classmate of Mises.
Sí, pero Mises en su memoir se escribe...
Yes, but Mises in his memoirs writes, "He's not one of us. The Austrian school is this, and Schumpeter is out there." Was Mises fair?
Algunas cosas, tiene algunas cosas muy brillantes, pero no es un austriaco, ¿no?
Yes, he has some brilliant ideas, but he is not an Austrian. Is that a defect? For me, yes, especially because he studied with the greatest ones. He was a pupil of Bauer. Mises did not hold him in much esteem.
¿Qué opinión les merecen las tecnologías de blockchain?
What is your opinion on technologies, blockchain, and smart contracts as a path to the stateless society or microstates?
Esa es la idea.
Well, that's the idea. What am I afraid of? Many people see blockchain as a technology, and others see Bitcoin, for example, as a method of speculation. The idea of Bitcoin is to be money, not a speculative asset. The idea is to replace state money. People have to think about it like this. If they do, we are going the correct way. I see blockchain as a technology, which is already used in public administrations. It can help officials do their job. And indeed, if we are not aware of what we are doing, all technologies can be reverted. They can be used against oneself. The internet can be used to free, but as it is used, for example, in countries like China, according to what they say, it is being used to control, to track what you do and what you see.
Yo por eso creo que lo de la batalla de las ideas es tan importante por eso.
That's why I think the battle of ideas is so important, because technology is a tool that can be used for good, that is, for more freedom, or for evil, right? China is a technological dictatorship that video surveillances you and monitors you on the internet and uses all the technology to dominate, not to avoid domination.
Tenemos el ejemplo de la imprenta. Fue una tecnología.
We have the example of the printing press. It was a technology that allowed, in its beginning, cheap books to be published, accessed new culture and knowledge, but it was quickly used for indoctrination. School textbooks were used to teach all children the same thing or to control what was read. It can be used for one thing or the other. Technology is neutral. It is a good thing if Bitcoin is used, hypothetically, as proposed by its founder, as an element to weaken the power of the state by eliminating monetary power, the state's ability to issue currency. It isn't a good thing if it's used as an investment asset, to buy and sell.
Y hay una teoría que el Estado efectivamente llega a la innovación.
And there is a theory that the state takes ownership of the innovation.
El Estado va a intentar patrimonializarlo todo.
Indeed, the state is going to try to absorb everything. The state is a machine that concentrates power, and very skilled. So, in that concentration of power logic, any innovation that threatens the status quo of power, the state is going to activate its political means. I do think the state is very skilled, and that's why you have to constantly denounce it and constantly show the threat it represents. The state, ultimately, is that. It is a machine of oppression.
También tecnologías que inventó el Estado, como la escritura, por ejemplo.
There are also technologies that invented the state, like writing. They can turn it around and use it against the state. Or accounting. Technology is neutral. It is the use that is given to it, and the purpose. Blockchain technology can be used for either one thing or the other.
Y el Estado es falible. El Estado va a intentar concentrar poder.
And the state is fallible. The state is going to try to concentrate power, but it is fallible. The state makes mistakes. It's made of people too. It does not have divine powers. That's one thing I believe with China, right? China miscalculates. It has evident problems of calculation. The small Chinas don't have them.
Es que hay muchas Chinas. Usted compara las Chinas pequeñas con las grandes.
There are many Chinas. You compare the small Chinas with the big one. Let's see which one does better. Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia too. There is a large Chinese population there. They are small Chinas, populated by Chinese. Which ones are doing better?